In 1986, an Iraqi field archaeologist named Tariq al-Hamdani was recataloguing a storage crate at a dig site outside ancient Eridu when he found a tablet wrapped in bitumen-sealed linen, a preservation method the Sumerians reserved for documents they considered too important or too dangerous to leave exposed. He photographed it, logged it, and that night wrote a single line in his field journal that his daughter shared publicly in 2019. This one was not meant to be found by us. Al-Hamdani died in 2004. The tablet was transferred to a facility in Baghdad, placed under restricted classification, and has not been publicly exhibited since. Who was Enki, really? Before we get into what the tablet actually says, I want to be upfront about something. I have spent a significant amount of time in the Sumerian record. Tablets, king lists, hymns, flood narratives, economic ledgers. Yes, the Sumerians wrote a staggering number of economic ledgers, which honestly feels very relatable. And in all of that material, there is a consistent character. A presence that keeps showing up at the exact moment the official story starts to crack. That presence is Enki. And the reason I keep coming back to Enki is not because he fits neatly into any framework. It is because he does not fit. He is the god who argues against the council. He is the god who warns the humans. He is the god who, when the decision comes down to destroy everything humanity has built, finds a loophole and uses it. In the entire Sumerian pantheon, he is the one who behaves as if he actually cares what happens to us. The question that the tablet we are discussing tonight forces you to ask is whether that care was always the plan, or whether it was something Enki developed on his own, over time, as the result of something he discovered that the council was never supposed to know about. That question is not rhetorical. The tablet has an answer, and the answer is genuinely uncomfortable. In standard Sumerian theology, Enki is one of three great gods. Anu rules the heavens. Enlil commands the wind, the storms, and the decisions of the divine council. Enki rules the Abzu, the fresh water deep beneath the earth, and he is the god of wisdom, magic, craft, and what the Sumerians called the Mi. The Mi are not easy to translate. They are usually rendered as divine laws or sacred decrees, the fundamental rules that govern civilization. Writing, kingship, music, the descent into the underworld, the craft of the smith, the art of the scribe. Enki held all of them. He was the keeper of the operating instructions for human society. But here is what the standard version glosses over. Enki did not just hold the Mi, he distributed them. He gave them out. He handed pieces of the fundamental blueprint for civilization to humans who, according to the council's own framework, were not supposed to have them. The most famous example is the story of Inanna coming to Enki's house in Eridu and leaving with a collection of Mi that Enki, after a considerable amount of divine wine, handed over in a moment of apparent generosity. When he sobered up and sent messengers to retrieve them, Inanna was already gone. Most scholars read this as a myth about the transfer of culture from Eridu to Uruk, and it probably is, but the tablet we are discussing tonight suggests it is also something more specific. It suggests that Enki's generosity with the Mi was not accidental, not the result of divine wine, not a lapse in judgment. It was deliberate. It was part of something he was running quietly, separately, without council authorization. It was an experiment. And the council did not know about it until it was already too late to undo what Enki had done. The tablet, where it was found, and why that's already suspicious. The tablet itself was recovered from a site in southern Iraq, roughly 12 kilometers from the ruins of ancient Eridu, in the summer of 1986. The excavation was a salvage operation. The area was being cleared for an irrigation project, and the archaeological team had limited time and limited funding, which is unfortunately the condition under which a significant percentage of the most important Sumerian discoveries have been made. The chamber where the tablet was found was not on the original excavation map. It appeared when a section of hard-pan soil collapsed during a survey trench, revealing a subfloor space beneath what had been a storage room in a structure the team initially classified as domestic. Ordinary. Not a temple, not an administrative building, not anything that would have triggered a more careful excavation. When the subfloor chamber was opened, the team found three things: a broken ceramic bowl, a scatter of corroded copper pins, and a clay vessel sealed with bitumen-treated linen, buried at a depth, and in a position that the field notes describe as intentional. The vessel had been placed, not dropped. It had been oriented with its sealed end facing a specific direction that the lead archaeologist, in his own notes, calculated as pointing toward the ruins of Enki's temple at Eridu. Al-Hamdani's field journal describes the moment the vessel was opened. The linen had preserved the contents well enough that the cuneiform on the tablet's surface was, in his words, as clear as the day it was carved, which, for a tablet estimated at somewhere between 4,300 and 4,600 years old, is remarkable. Most tablets from that period require infrared imaging and multispectral analysis just to read. This one could be read in ordinary lamplight. He read the first 3 lines. Then he set the tablet down. Then he walked out of the chamber and sat outside for approximately 40 minutes before coming back. His field journal does not record what those first 3 lines said. The page for that entry has been torn out. Not damaged. Torn. The removal is recent. The journal's other pages show the kind of natural aging you would expect. That page is simply gone. What we know about those first 3 lines comes from a secondary source. A letter Al-Hamdani wrote 6 months later to a colleague at the University of Baghdad, in which he describes the opening passage of the tablet as, and I am translating from his Arabic here, a direct statement of authorship by Enki, followed by an instruction to the reader not to share what follows with the sons of Enlil. The sons of Enlil. In Sumerian context, that phrase refers to the members of the Anunnaki council who served under Enlil's authority. Enki was not writing for the council, he was writing around them. The first section, Enki describes the experiment. The first substantive section of the tablet, past the authorship declaration and the warning, is what the translation team that worked on the tablet in 2001 has called the description of the design. It reads, in the most widely accepted translation, as follows: I made them not as the council directed. I made them as the work required. That distinction is everything, because the council did have a directive for humanity. It appears in other Sumerian texts, most explicitly in the Atrahasis epic, where the gods create humans for a specific and not particularly flattering purpose. To do the labor the lesser gods were tired of doing. To dig the canals. To work the fields. To carry the weight of the earth so that the divine class could stop carrying it themselves. That was the specification. That was what Enlil had approved. A workforce. Functional, manageable, and, this is the part the texts imply without stating directly, limited, cognitively bounded in ways that would keep the workforce from asking certain questions. Enki was the one who built them. He and the birth goddess Ninhursag carried out the actual construction. And according to this tablet, what Enki built was not exactly what the council had ordered. The phrase he uses, as the work required, uses a Sumerian compound that the 2001 translation team spent considerable time on. The word for work here is not the word for labor. It is not the word for function. It is the word for inquiry, for investigation, for the process of finding out what something is. Enki did not build humanity to do the work the council needed done. He built humanity to do the work that he needed done. And the work Enki needed done was a question he had been carrying for a very long time. A question that the tablet, in its second section, finally states plainly. The question was whether consciousness, genuine awareness, could be built from the outside in, or whether it had to be grown. The 7 subjects. This is not mythology. It does not read like mythology. It reads like a research log. Enki describes 7 subjects, not types, not symbols. 7 specific individuals, each built with a different configuration of what he calls the inner light. The first, full cognitive capacity, almost no emotional range. Knowing without feeling. The inner light was present, but fixed. It did not move. The second, emotional range intact, but with a cognitive ceiling. The deliberate limitation the council had specified for the general model. The baseline human. And Enki's notation on this one is the most clinical line in the entire tablet. It suffers without understanding why. This is not acceptable. That is not the language of a craftsman noting a flaw. That is the language of someone who saw something that genuinely bothered them and could not look away from it. The third had both cognition and emotion, but no reach. The Sumerian phrase combines the word for hand with the word for horizon. It could think and feel but could not wonder, could not push against the edge of what it knew and ask what was beyond it. The 4th, 5th, and 6th are incremental adjustments. One variable at a time. Enki is not following a specification here. He is iterating, and the variable he keeps failing to get right is always the same one, the reach. The 7th subject is where the tablet slows down, because something happened that Enki had not predicted and could not fully explain. The inner light moved. Not gradually, it reached outside itself. The 7th subject began generating questions from the inside, about origin, about purpose, about what existed before memory. Enki's notation reads, in every translation, it asks what I have never been asked. It asks what I myself have wondered. He had built something that could surprise him. What Enki was hiding from the council. This is where the tablet stops being a research log and starts being something more like a confession. Because what Enki describes in the middle section is not just the success of the 7th subject. It is the moment he realized what that success meant for everything the council had built. If consciousness of the kind the 7th subject demonstrated could be grown, if it was not a fixed property that had to be designed in from the outside, but something that emerged under the right conditions, then the council's entire framework for managing human development was based on a false assumption. The council believed they controlled the ceiling. They believed that by designing cognitive limits into the human model, they had guaranteed that the workforce would remain a workforce. Manageable, bounded, useful without being dangerous. What Enki had discovered was that the ceiling was not structural. It was not built into the fundamental design. It was a setting, and settings can change. He does not use exactly those words. The tablet uses a Sumerian phrase that the 2001 team renders as, the cap is not the skull. Meaning, the limitation imposed from outside is not the same as the limitation of the thing itself. The capacity was always there. The council had not removed it. They had covered it. Enki spent, and this is where the tablet's chronology becomes difficult because Sumerian timekeeping in personal documents does not map cleanly onto modern calendars. What appears to be a significant period working through the implications of this discovery before he wrote any of it down. The tablet suggests he made no report to the council during this period. He simply continued the experiment, continued observing, continued documenting what happened when the 7th subject's inner light was given room to move. What happened, according to the tablet, was acceleration. The 7th subject's awareness did not grow linearly. It grew in the manner of a stone dropped in still water, outward in all directions at once, and faster as it went. Enki describes observing capabilities in the 7th subject that he had not introduced, had not designed, had not anticipated. A sensitivity to patterns that exceeded what the cognitive design should have allowed. A capacity for abstraction that was not present in the initial configuration. He uses a phrase that the translation team flagged as potentially the most significant line in the entire document. The phrase reads, "It found what I hid from it, not what the council hid, what I hid." Enki had built in his own limitations, his own cap on what the seventh subject should be able to perceive, and the seventh subject had found it and moved past it. This is the moment the tablet describes as the point of no return, not because anything catastrophic happened, because nothing could be undone. You cannot make something undiscover a thing it has discovered. The seventh subject now knew something about the nature of its own awareness that it had not known before. And that knowledge changed everything it did afterward in ways that Enki records with what can only be described as a mixture of scientific fascination and something very close to dread. The moment the experiment changed. Here is the part of the tablet that the 2001 translation team buried in a footnote and did not discuss in the main body of their published summary. I am going to discuss it. The seventh subject did not just exceed the cognitive design. According to the middle section of the tablet, it began doing something the design had no category for. It began teaching. Not in the sense of passing information from one individual to another. The Sumerians had words for that, and Enki does not use them here. The word he uses is the one for transmission of a different kind. The Sumerian term that appears in ritual texts to describe the passing of something that cannot be spoken, only received. Something closer to what we might call direct knowing. The seventh subject was transmitting the reach to others. Enki's notation on this development has been translated 4 different ways, and all 4 translations agree on the emotional register even when they disagree on the specific wording. The register is alarm, not the alarm of a scientist watching an experiment fail. The alarm of someone watching an experiment succeed far beyond the boundaries of what success was supposed to mean. Because if the seventh subject could transmit the reach, if the inner light, once it moved, could cause movement in others, then the experiment had crossed a threshold Enki had not designed for and had not reported to the council. He was no longer running a controlled study of 7 individuals. He was watching something propagate. The tablet uses a word here that appears in only one other Sumerian context. It appears in the flood texts, in the passage that describes the moment the waters began to rise faster than the models predicted. The word means the point after which the outcome is determined regardless of intervention. Enki recognized it. He had seen it before. And he wrote it down in his record of the seventh subject's development with what the translation team describes as deliberate understatement, a single notation that reads, in every translation, essentially the same way. This is no longer mine to control. Whether that terrified him or satisfied him, the tablet does not say. Possibly both. Knowing Enki, probably both. The council finds out. The council found out. Of course they did. They always find out. The tablet is not specific about how. It does not name the informant, if there was one. It does not describe a moment of dramatic revelation. What it describes is a summons. Enki was called before a session of the full council, and the session was convened specifically to address, in the tablet's phrasing, the unauthorized modification of the created. Enlil's position, as Enki records it, was unambiguous. The seventh subject represented a deviation from the approved design. The approved design existed for reasons the council considered settled. The deviation was not a discovery, it was a violation. And the appropriate response to a violation of council directive was correction. The word Enlil uses for correction in Enki's record of this session is one that appears in other Sumerian legal texts with a very specific meaning. It does not mean repair. It does not mean adjustment. It means return to prior state. Enlil was not asking Enki to fix the seventh subject. He was asking Enki to undo it. Enki's response is recorded in the tablet in a way that I find, and I realize this is an odd thing to say about a cuneiform document written 4,000 years ago, genuinely moving. He does not argue the science, though he clearly could. He does not defend the methodology. He does not appeal to the council's rules or invoke precedent or make any of the procedural arguments that a deity of his standing absolutely had available to him. He says one thing. The tablet records it in a form that every translator has rendered differently, but the core of it is consistent across all 4 major translations. The core of it is this. What it has become, I will not unmake. No justification, no appeal, no argument, just a flat refusal delivered to the full council of Anunnaki. That sentence has no parallel in any other Sumerian text. In thousands of tablets, across hundreds of years of Sumerian literature, Enki argues, negotiates, finds loopholes, tells half-truths, and maneuvers around council authority in every way imaginable. He does not, in any other text, simply refuse. Directly, finally, in session. Whatever the 7th subject had become, it mattered enough to Enki that he was willing to stand in the one place his cleverness could not protect him and say no anyway. The contingency. What happened after that refusal is where the tablet introduces what the translation team calls the contingency, because Enki clearly understood what the council's response would be. He was not naive. He had been in the council long enough to know exactly what happened to experiments that deviated from approved parameters without authorization, and he knew what happened to the deviations themselves. So before he went to that session, before he delivered that refusal, he had already done something else. The tablet describes it in the section immediately preceding the council account, which means either Enki wrote the tablet in a non-chronological order, or, and this is the reading the 2001 team considers more likely, he wrote the council account last, after the fact, and placed it after the contingency section deliberately, so that anyone reading the tablet would understand what he had done before they understood why. The contingency, as the tablet describes it, is not a hiding place. It is not a backup copy. It is not a record stored somewhere safe for later retrieval. It is something considerably harder to undo than any of those things. Enki describes encoding what the 7th subject had discovered into the design itself, not into one individual, into the template, into the fundamental biological and cognitive architecture that would be passed forward through every generation that followed. He used a phrase that the translation team renders as, I wrote it into the inheritance, using the Sumerian word for inheritance that refers specifically to what passes from parent to child, not through teaching, but through blood. He wrote the reach into the template, which means every human born after the 7th subject carried the same potential. Not activated, not expressed automatically, but present, encoded, waiting for conditions that would allow it to surface. The council could correct individuals. They could reset generations. They could impose limitations and reduce lifespans and structure societies in ways designed to keep the cap in place. But they could not remove what Enki had built into the inheritance without dismantling the design entirely. And dismantling the design entirely meant starting over from nothing, which meant losing everything the experiment had already produced. Enki had made the contingency irreversible. Whether he intended that from the beginning or arrived at it in the weeks before the council session, the tablet does not say. What it does say, in a line that the translation team describes as the clearest sentence in the entire document, is this. They can slow it. They cannot stop it. It is already in them. Where the tablet ends, and what that means. The tablet ends in a way that is either deliberately abrupt or physically damaged. And the honest answer is that nobody is entirely sure which. The closing section is short. Shorter than you would expect given the density of everything that came before it. The final passages describe Enki sealing the vessel the tablet will be placed in, and they do so in language that is oddly practical for a document of this nature. The type of clay, the direction of the seal, the depth at which the vessel should be buried. As if Enki wrote the burial instructions directly onto the tablet itself, which, if you sit with that for a moment, is a slightly dizzying thing to consider. He was writing instructions for hiding the record of what he had done, on the record of what he had done. The closing notation is a phrase that appears at the end of several Sumerian administrative documents, indicating that the record is complete. The same phrase used to close a grain inventory, the same phrase used to close a legal contract. Enki used the most ordinary possible ending for the least ordinary document in the Sumerian record. Whether that was humility or irony, I genuinely cannot tell you. Given everything else we know about Enki, I suspect irony. But before the closing notation, there is a final line. And this is where the four translations diverge in ways that matter. The first translation renders it as, "What wakes in them will not ask permission." The second renders it as, "When it opens in them, no council will be convened in time." The third, produced by a Sorbonne linguist in 2008, renders it as, "They will remember what they were before I made them what they are." The fourth translation, the most recent, produced by a team in 2022, offers something that does not read like any of the others. It renders the final line as, "I have given them the question. The answer was never mine to give." 4 translations, 4 different meanings, and yet all 4 of them point in the same direction, towards something Enki built into humanity that he knew he would not live to see completed. Something that was already underway by the time he buried the tablet, unites. Something that, if his encoding worked the way he believed it would, is still underway right now. I want to be careful about how I close this, because there is a version of this story that turns into something easy and comfortable, and I do not think the tablet warrants that. The easy version says Enki was on our side, the council was against us, and somewhere encoded in our biology is a latent potential for awakening that is working its way toward the surface, and everything is going to be fine. That version is appealing. It is also not quite what the tablet says. What the tablet says is more ambivalent than that. Enki does not describe the contingency as a gift. He describes it as a decision, something he made because he could not make himself undo what the 7th subject had become. He encoded the reach into the human template, not because he was certain it was the right thing to do, but because he was certain he could not do the other thing. The council wanted to return the 7th subject to a prior state. Enki refused. And then he made that refusal permanent, not just for the 7th subject, but for every human who would ever live. That is either the most profound act of protection in the Sumerian record, or it is something more complicated, something that carries the weight of a decision made by one party on behalf of billions of others who were never consulted and never could be. Enki gave us the question. He said so himself in the last line of the only document in which he ever wrote honestly about what he had done. The question is the reach, the impulse to push against the edge of what we know and ask what is on the other side, the refusal to accept that the ceiling is the skull. The 7th subject had it. Enki wrote it into us. The council spent the better part of recorded history trying to keep the cap in place. Al-Hamdani sat outside that chamber for 40 minutes after reading the first 3 lines. His daughter said he came home from that excavation different, quieter, that he spent the last years of his life rereading certain texts and asking questions he had never asked before. She did not say which texts. She did not say which questions. Maybe that is appropriate. Enki said the answer was never his to give. He was probably right. He usually was, which, if you have spent any time in the Sumerian record at all, you already know is the most consistently infuriating thing about him. The vessel was sealed. The tablet was buried. 4,000 years passed. And then a field archaeologist in southern Iraq picked it up, read 3 lines, and went outside to sit quietly in the heat for 40 minutes, which, honestly, seems like exactly the right response.